In this brief video, we're going to take a quick look here at the theories of the place of composition of the Gospel of John, as well as how we're going about dating when the Gospel of John was likely to have been written. So we'll begin here, first of all, by noting that the theory that has the most support behind it is that the Gospel of John was composed in Ephesus. So Irenaeus, his testimony in Against Heresies, states that this is when it was composed. Eusebius, in his church history, also gives kind of testimony to the tradition that it was in Ephesus. And some have looked for details inside the letter itself that might indicate that the author has a concern with situations that we might know elsewhere about early Christianity in Ephesus. And so there's interesting that there's an emphasis on John the Baptist in Ephesus. According to Acts 18 and Acts 19, there are disciples of John the Baptist. And in the Gospel of John, we find that the author is once again trying to do what the other authors, the Synoptic Gospel authors, try to do, and that is show the preeminence of Jesus over John the Baptist, so that John the Baptist himself points to Jesus as being someone more superior than himself. So people will look at that and try to speculate maybe this is why we're seeing this emphasis, because we know that in Ephesus there was this kind of cult of John the Baptist that was there. And also because there seems to be a hostile relationship between non-Christian Jews and Jewish Christians in Ephesus, and there's certainly a tension between Jesus and who John refers to as the Jews. Primarily he means Jewish leadership. So there's a tension that's there in John's gospel. And so once again, looking for a possible background that is reflective in the gospel to lend support to the favor of Ephesus as its place. Now, against Ephesus, people wonder there's no mention of John's residence in Ephesus by Ignatius of Antioch. So the tradition was that John the Apostle is the beloved disciple, and that the beloved disciple is present with Jesus' mother, who is interestingly not named, but just described as Jesus' mother, and at the crucifixion. And that at some time later, John and Mary leave Jerusalem and they go to Ephesus. So Ephesus becomes a place where Christianity, rises, or where there becomes a number of believers or followers in the area. Now, Ignatius of Antioch describes his travels and it makes reference to Ephesus, but he doesn't indicate anything about John's connection to Ephesus. And so if John did go to Ephesus, if John is the beloved disciple, which that in itself is not clear, or I think it's not likely, then we have to try to explain why Ignatius might not have mentioned that particular fact. The book of Acts and Paul only know of John's base in Jerusalem. So as far as the Gospels or as far as the New Testament evidence is concerned, John never leaves Jerusalem. Now, that doesn't mean that the tradition is false and that he didn't leave it, but as far as we know from Acts and Galatians, John's base is in Jerusalem. All right, so basically we only have Ephesus as the really only place that has won any favor, and so everything else would just be speculation, as even Ephesus is speculation. So in terms of the date of composition, this too gets somewhat tricky. we do have the P52, which we've talked about. You're seeing a photo here, once again, P52, that is a portion of John's Gospel, and was originally dated quite early, early 2nd century. Of course, there are other experts on papyri and manuscript evidence who suggests a later date based upon some of the ways in which the letters are written and some of the abbreviation marks in it. So it is not conclusive that it's early 2nd century, but that's where a number of people think or have concluded is the date of that piece of fragment. But of course, even with a fragment, we have to be careful because there could be written sayings or written pieces of tradition that doesn't necessarily mean that it belonged to an entirely composed book. Now, P52 looks, because it's written on the front and the back, looks like it probably comes from a codex. And if that is the case, the codex is something that was developed a little bit later, so we're not talking about a papyri roll, which would have been the earlier ways in which some scribes wrote on or copied material. So P52 as evidence for a very early dating of John's Gospel is still somewhat speculative. So these indicators, the emphasis on Jesus as the replacement of the temple and Jewish feast. So very oftentimes in John's Gospel, we see Jesus as something as somehow or another related to temple festivals or even the temple itself. So the speculation has been that this contrast between Jesus and the temple is taking place because the temple has now been destroyed. And with the loss of the temple, where is the person or where is the place where one encounters God's presence? In John's Gospel, one encounters God through Jesus Christ, because the Word of God becomes incarnate in Jesus. And Jesus and the Father are one. And so the connection with God comes through the connection with Jesus as kind of a replacement of the temple in its absence. Now, there is an emphasis on Peter's martyrdom at the end of John's Gospel. So, again, from church tradition, there's a tradition that Peter was executed or martyred for his faith under the reign of Nero. Again, this is tradition. If that's the case, and we know when Nero's reign basically ends, or 68 AD, then we have to date Peter's martyrdom before that event. So if we just roughly take 65 as a possible date, and this gospel has information that points to Peter's martyrdom in chapter 21, then we have to consider this author knows about Peter's death. And if that's the case, then it's after 65 AD. Of course, the other issue that we have to deal with is that the ending of John's Gospel looks like an appendix. In other words, we already have an ending in chapter 20, and that looks like it sums up, and this looks like an additional material. So it's possible that the Gospel itself could have been written before that appendix. And so the appendix could have been written after 65 or after the period of Nero, well past AD 70, but the gospel itself was written earlier. Now we have Thomas's confession of Jesus and Domitian's official title, both being Lord and God. So that's an interesting thing, that Thomas confesses Jesus as Lord and God. Domitian wanted to be addressed as Lord and God, and Domitian's as emperor was between 81 through 96. So some have looked at that little episode as indicating, once again, that we are talking about a later date for John's Gospel. That it wasn't done before AD 70, and that you need to really look for it somewhere in the 80s or in the 90s. So we mentioned about P52 and dates around 125 to 150. Again, there is speculation that it could even be older, and so it contains that fragment of John 18. And the last piece that I'll just mention here is about the idea of expulsion from the synagogue. So in John 9:22, we have the story about Jesus healing a blind man, and then the Pharisees want to question the healed blind man, who makes a kind of his declaration of allegiance to Jesus, and then they want to bring in his parents to find out about their son and how this happened, and it indicates that parents are afraid that they could be expelled out of the synagogue. So now this has been an area of a lot of discussion amongst scholars about the reality of expelling a person for confessing Jesus as Lord or as Messiah in the pre-70 Judaism. So Judaism in the period before AD 70 was quite diverse. There are Jews who believed lots of different things. And it's not quite clear that certainly that the Pharisees have control over synagogues, that they can practice excommunication either in Jerusalem or anywhere else because a Jew wants to think that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, we do know that excommunication, or casting people out, practicing, as it were, some kind of ostracism, was a thing that occurred within Jewish communities. It certainly occurred within the Qumran community. They would expel or excommunicate someone who didn't live up to their standards. The problem is trying to find clear evidence before AD 70 that Pharisees had any kind of control to have such a rule, and certainly such a rule so quickly, after the Jesus ministry would have begun, to have this kind of in place. So the theory, oftentimes, we're looking at John 9, is that this is a reflection of a later experience of Christians in the post AD 70 Judaism, that after the temple is gone and after there becomes a movement to try and exercise more control over Jewish communities via the synagogue, that rabbis or Pharisees gained more of that control or that influence and exerted that influence, and saw Christians as Jewish Christians as somehow or another behaving in ways that were in jeopardy of the community, and then they were casting them out. So that John's Gospel reflects that experience in this episode. So, so the John 9 passage has created this way of kind of looking at the text in a different light. There are some who do want to argue that such expulsions could have been possible, and that this is reflecting something that was decided upon maybe in a limited state within Jerusalem. I'm not trying to require that it's something that was taking place throughout all synagogues in Palestine. So if it is a reflection of something that was occurring later rather than earlier, then once again, we're going to have to push the date of John's Gospel somewhere into the likely 80s or into the 90s. So, by and large, just to kind of conclude, we think that the Gospel of John, most scholarships on John are going to date it after AD 70. And this, another thing that we could add here to this is the kind of growing popularity of the theory that John's Gospel might be aware of Mark's Gospel or utilize Mark's Gospel, or one of the others, Matthew or Luke. So there's come some scholars who are beginning to see that as a possibility. If that is the case, and if we date Mark's Gospel somewhere in the 60s, then once again, you're going to have to push John's Gospel quite some time after that to give enough time for John's Gospel to, get a hold of Mark's Gospel and then begin to think about how he's responding to it. So the likelihood, what most scholars are thinking, is it's certainly after AD 70. You could find a few scholars that want to date it into the second century, especially if P52 is a much later work. But the majority of Johannine, what we call Johannine scholars, are dating it somewhere in the 80s or possibly the 90s of the first century. All right, that'll take us through the place and date of the composition of the gospel.